You are listening to Sheep Might Fly, a podcast of serialised fiction and occasional essays written and read by Tansy Rayner Roberts. Our current original story serial is Something Frightful, a cosy romantic fantasy about a chaotic witchy family, a gloomy gothic manor house, and the executive assistant they all need in their lives. Chapter 7. A House Party with Tureens. Part 1. Why am I saying part 1? It's A. It's 7A, and then there will be a 7B. My chapters are getting longer. This is how I'm dealing with it. 7A. Every dining room is a temporary prison where politeness chains the guests to the laden board. Renard. If you can believe it, said Daniel, former Australian soap star and current blight-in-law, in his drawling Australian accent. This is less of a shit show than the last big blight all-in family shindig. He'd spoken just quietly enough that the only two people who heard, probably, were Libby and Daniel's glamorous wife, Glad. All three of them were pressed against the corridor wall, trying not to be accidentally clubbed around the head by the flailing broomsticks wielded by great-aunts Batty, Birdie, and Binky, a chaotic force of nature, if ever there was one. These three old beans were dressed in all black, with literal pointy hats, rocking the classic crone aesthetic so hard that Libby would not have been surprised to learn they'd been modelling for Witchmas cards since the 19th century. "He's right," said Glad in a deadpan voice, checking her eyeliner in a compact mirror, then taking a selfie with a phone that hung from a jewelled cuff on her wrist. "Last time the orchestra sued the family for trauma in the workplace." "Night's still young," warned Daniel. This was the largest quantity of blights that Libby had seen gathered in one place. They crammed into the corridor outside the dining room like they were queuing for Selkie Whisker concert tickets. Libby had massively overthought the dress code situation. There was no consistency at all in the choices made by this chaotic household. Daniel and Glad wore jeans and jumpers. Hers was a designer pairing. Libby recognised Glad's ensemble from the last issue of Glamoured that had landed on Libby's desk while she was finalising the Blackpool Rights era of Anna Minotaur's funeral tour. While Daniel's looked like something he'd dug out from under a bed. Glad was blonde this week, a sharper and whiter tone than her husband's natural sandy hair, and her makeup was all in silvers and pale pinks. Further up the corridor, the triplets known as the Upper Girls, Beryl, Florence, Prunella, were garbed in near-identical dinner-party chic, all black silk and pearls, looking somehow both timeless and terribly old-fashioned. And most of all like they were feeling the cold and annoyed about it. Libby had no regrets about avoiding this problem herself. Winifred was also in black, a wide tutu skirt, striped pink and black stockings, and a short but incredibly fluffy bone-white jacket, which looked a million times warmer than whatever her elder sisters had going on. She was chatting to Sabella, 22, and Thaddeus, 18, the babies of their respective family lines. Sabella wore pyjama pants, a lavender flannel shirt that fell to her knees, and a shapeless grey beanie tugged over her ears. She was still somehow even more impossibly beautiful than her second oldest cousin. Thaddeus, who had shoulders nearly as wide as Horace's, paired with a familiar prettiness, which made him look like Sabella's brother rather than cousin, wore leather pants and a long-sleeved shirt that must be older than he was. There was a general cluster of blight brothers that Libby didn't know well: Cecil, Ibsen, Titus, Quentin, dressed in a haphazard variety of tweed, wool, and at least one of Winifred's hand-knit black jumpers. They were a good-looking bunch. None of the blights were exactly hard on the eye, but clearly had no particular interest in dressing to impress. at least for a family gathering. Asphodel, the only other member of the younger tier of the Blight family who Libby knew to be married, wore a lab coat, a large pair of spectacles, and an expression of extreme lack of wanting to be here. Asphodel's husband, the infamous Dexter Demdike, an occasional favourite on Anna Minotaur's elaborate lists for potential gala guests, was not present this evening. And Livy was pretty sure had not set foot in Frightful Manor in the weeks she'd been living here. She'd never heard a member of the family even mention that he existed. Silas and Mary turned up late, hovering at the edge of the crowd and chatting together in hushed tones, though Silas had caught Libby's eye at one point and waved. Mary wore the same faded denims and comfy jumper that Libby had seen him in earlier that day. Silas, who had definitely been wearing a couture floral silk suit when he swanned in and out of the Beaks' office a few hours ago, now wore a ripped black T-shirt featuring Bela Lugosi's Dracula, and a pair of jeans that looked like they'd been painted on. Either he planned to go clubbing afterwards, or the prospect of dinner with his parents had spurred him to act like a teenager. Finally there was Mabel, the one who'd got out and rarely visited the manor. Libby had asked Winifred about this prodigal sister days ago and gleaned only a few details. Mabel worked at an art gallery, lived a largely amagical life in London for reasons no one in the family seemed to comprehend, and had a very tall girlfriend who worked in creature control and had, for some reason, chosen not to attend this dinner party. Mabel had not yet taken her coat off, and hovered near Silas and Mary as if all three of them wanted to be near the exit. It was already 10 past the hour, but no one made a move to push open any of the nearby arched doors. Clearly everyone was waiting for a sign of some kind. Libby jumped, startled, as a pair of doors were flung open at the wrong end of the corridor. An elderly man, an old bean, presumably, powered through in a wheelchair that looked like it had been built out of 3 discarded unicycles and a 1980s computer bank. He had a long white beard, a wicked gleam in his eye, 2 literal swords strapped to the back of the wheelchair, and was dressed in an outfit that Libby would later describe to Sylphie as Pantomime Merlin on Pride Night. Except even at the panto, they wouldn't dress Merlin up in pink velour, would they? Would they? The ancient wizard in hot pink robes and bunny slippers zoomed forward, forcing his younger family members to leap out of the way. "What are you waiting for, sheeple?" he barked, then pulled up directly in front of Daniel, Glad, and Libby. "What's that Australian thing you say, crocodile surfboard?" he said, snapping his fingers at Daniel. Glad rolled her eyes. Daniel just grinned. "Hello, Great Uncle Malthus. I reckon you say it more than I do." Great Uncle Malthus, who was rapidly becoming Libby's favourite blight, waved a hand impatiently. "We're not here to fuck spiders," Daniel said clearly, in a stronger accent than daily use. Great Uncle Malthus laughed so hard he was in danger of keeling over, wheelchair and all. "That's the one. We're not here to fuck spiders, blights," he added in a louder voice, "and I hate cold soup." He zoomed forward, scattering the upper girls and raising 2 hands like he was conducting an orchestra. The largest arched doorway at the end of the corridor flung open, and music actually did fill the air. The string quartet, presumably. The dining room had been decorated within an inch of its life. Tea-light candles burned inside lanterns, carved not only from pumpkins, but other root vegetables, turnips, swedes, and enormous beets. The pumpkins had bats and owls cut into them. Only the noblier and smaller root vegetables had faces. But the effect was entirely creepy. Libby made a mental note that this could be a creative way to use up some of the cucumber glut once the open day was over. Winifred's dolls, the ones so recently appropriated by Prunella, hung from black netting affixed to the chandeliers. Winifred, when she saw them, pressed her lips together in a pout, and chose a seat which did not have her own creations suspended directly above. The other Blights picked seats too. Most of them swerved first to greet the trio who stood in a foreboding cluster near the head of the table. Morrigan Blight, mother of 8, from Beryl to Sibylla. 13 decades old. She had literally lived for the entire 20th century, and then some. Morrigan didn't look any older than the upper girls, though she was half their height, and as solidly built as Horace, who Libby could not help noticing had not yet graced them with his presence. She wore the same basic black as the great-aunts, though without pointy hat or broom to make her witching credentials blatant. She looked as if she was trying to turn everyone in the room to stone with the power of her mind. Beside her, Cromont Blight, Morrigan's twin brother, in white tie and tails, as if he had bought his first formal suit in 1925 and never bothered to upgrade. His overly dramatic moustache added to the effect of a man outside his time. He was as tall and skinny as Morrigan was short and squat, even more of a beanpole than Silas, though his suit was not tailored as closely as his son usually preferred. Father of 8, from Horace to Thaddeus. Cromont's expression was neutral, but simmering. Somehow this was even more intimidating than Morrigan's unhinged glare. Libby recognised them in the same way that she knew what most of the amagical royal family looked like. The Blights might not get quite as much tabloid coverage as the royals, but they were literally in the history books. Libby had once written an essay for school on Cromont Blight's work as an adviser to Churchill during the war, and his subsequent high-profile dispute with the man over grazing rights in peach orchards. These two were the Blights who had thrown the title of Beak back and forth between them for decades, before their respective children stepped in with the recent coup. Clearly there were quite a few feelings brewing about this development. Between the siblings stood their hostess for the evening, Ophelia Westwood Blight, wife to Cromont, mother of 8, also from Horace to Thaddeus. Anyone who knew how to count could place Ophelia in her early 60s, and therefore less than half her husband's age. The Great Grim effect, and/or Ophelia's access to wealth and eternal magical skincare, pared away at least 2 decades. She looked brittle, unhappy, and yet luminous. Ophelia wore a pale lilac Moira Mestopheles ball gown, which certainly looked like it belonged to the later spring collection, but Libby was sure this particular garment had never been seen, or at least photographed, in public. Anna Minotaur had been obsessed with Moira Mestopheles, though the two women stopped speaking to each other in the late 90s. The string quartet were somewhere in this cavernous hall, but Libby couldn't see them, which felt almost as sinister as the challenging stare that Ophelia Westwood turned upon every member of her family as they entered. Daniel and Glad were clearly still feeling protective. They walked Libby to the table and sat her down, one on either side. Mary slid into the seat immediately opposite her. Silas had disappeared somewhere. Eventually all of the Blights, eggs, beans, and all, found their places. Great Uncle Malthus wheeled himself to what was presumably the foot of the table, being less dramatically lit than the other end. The 3 Blight parents still hovered, unseated, along with the elder girls. Everyone was tense. Glad, to Libby's left, clicked her tongue in disapproval. Daniel, to Libby's right, snorted slightly. The melodic sounds of the string quartet and the general mutterings of blight chatter at the table meant that their rebellious noises were not particularly noticeable. Mary gave Libby a vaguely sympathetic smile, and she found herself wondering how long he had known the family before being flung into a social situation like this one. Clearly, he was part of the furniture now. "Don't worry," Mary said, leaning forward. "Duels by fork hardly ever happen before the third course." Glad made a huffing sound. "So much posturing," she whispered. "Boring." "What is happening?" Libby couldn't help but ask. Daniel gave another snort. "I'm not saying I get all the complex layers," he said, keeping his voice as low as the rest of them, "but the beak always sits at the head of the table. Whoever sits on their left or right is a big deal. True allegiance or whatever. The joyous parentals are angling for our Horace to share his status with them. But he's always got along better with Morrigan. And Prunehilda over there is putting in her bid." Libby glanced up to see that Florence and Beryl had now taken seats, leaving Prunella standing awkwardly with her mother Morrigan, Aunt Ophelia, and Uncle Cromont. The seat at the head of the table, was indeed still empty, as were the seats on either side. There were other chairs available here and there along the table. Clearly there was no particular rigour when it came to RSVPs and +1s. This was not musical chairs. In other news, Horace was not the only member of the family who had not yet arrived. The music played on. Glad moaned and laid her head on the table. "I'm so hungry." "And did we learn anything about the watercress diet?" her husband teased. "There's not enough watercress in the world, even if it does make my skin glow. If dinner doesn't start soon, I'm going to start eating candles." Libby's eye was drawn to an open door behind Mary, one of those arched doorways that led to somewhere else in the house, probably another floor altogether. As she watched, 3 men strolled down a corridor and wandered into the dining room in quiet conversation. Without glancing up at where their parents, aunt and cousin lurked by the head of the table, Horace, Otis and Silas all separated, picking seats apparently at random. Silas, in his vampire punk t-shirt and tight jeans, ended up down near Mabel and Great-Uncle Malthus. Otis, in a simply dazzling black and gold suit, under an ankle-length embroidered coat, slid into the seat next to Mary. The lighting from the nearest chandeliers brought out golden highlights in his hair, because of course they did. Horace, wearing, as Libby had personally predicted, the same tweedy trousers and jumper he had worn all day in the Beaks' office, picked a seat beside Winifred and said something in a low voice that made her smile. A different kind of posturing, but it had an immediate effect. Ophelia Westwood looked homicidal. "Horace, what are you doing?" Horace glanced up. "Hello, Mother. You look nice. Sit down, will you all? I'd hate to delay Ma Cherry's menu even further." Ophelia took a few steps towards the table and placed a trembling hand on the back of the chair at the head. "Haven't you forgotten something, darling?" Horace gave her a brief smile. "This dinner was your idea, Mother. You sent the invitations. I believe that makes you hostess for the night. Wouldn't dream of stealing your thunder." He went back to talking to Winifred. Ophelia hesitated only a moment longer, then sank into the chair at the head, giving blistering looks to her husband and Prunella. They immediately sat on either side of her, expressions a little less obvious, but nevertheless put out. Silas waved to his Auntie Morrigan, offering her his own seat at the foot, beside Great-uncle Malthus, and opposite her visiting daughter Mabel. He then trotted back up to Mary and Otis. "Budge up, will you?" he told his brother. Otis rolled his eyes, but moved into the spare seat beside him, allowing Silas to squeeze in between he and Mary. "Lovely," he said, as if he hadn't been conspiring diabolically with two of his brothers. "What have we got in store from Ma Cherry? 12 courses?" Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Sheep Might Fly. This podcast was recorded on Palawa land. I acknowledge and pay respect to the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional and continuing custodians of Lutruwita. Sheep Might Fly is produced and edited by Andrew Finch. You can sign up to my author newsletter for updates. Follow me on Instagram, Blue Sky or Threads at TansyRR. And if you like this podcast, consider supporting me at Patreon, where you can receive all kinds of bonus rewards, early ebooks, and exclusive stories for a small monthly pledge. You can also listen to these podcast episodes 2 weeks early. I've recently launched the Teacup Magic Emporium at tansyrr.com, my author store, where you can buy signed paperbacks, merch, and more direct from the author. See you next week.